welcome to the Thunder and Lightning Show. John the Son of Thunder here with Ryan the Retrograde. We're going to be talking about one of the hot button issues today. So if you're on Twitter, maybe you're not, and we'll kind of go through a little bit about what happened. Taylor Marshall said he was attending the SSPX, and a lot of people started attacking him, saying that the SSPX are schismatics. One of the people that was sort of criticizing him was Tim Gordon. Now, I will say Tim Gordon didn't per se that the SSPX were schismatics. And I do have a few quotes from him, which I guess I can get to later. But the fact that people were criticizing Taylor Marshall for attending an SSPX mass during a time of crisis like this is pretty interesting. I mean, it calls a lot of calls a lot of things into question. This is a time, I don't know. It is a time of crisis. If the SSPX is the only mass available, well, we'll just talk about their canonical status and everything. I just want to kick it to you, Ryan, and see what's your reaction and to people like Patrick Coffin and Michael Voris calling the SSPX schismatics.
Yeah, this is one of the stupidest controversies that I have ever seen. And believe me, in traditionalism, there's a lot of stupid controversies. But of all the things to get worked up about now, it's like whether Taylor Marshall is going to an underground SSPX mass. Again, this whole thing is precipitated by the fact that the Novus Ordo bishops have canceled the mass. So who else is saying the mass? Well, you're down to underground masses by diocesan and religious order priests, SSPX priests, or Sedevacanist priests. I mean, you can't even go to like Byzantine Catholic or Eastern Orthodox. They're canceled too. So if you want the sacraments, if you want to receive Holy Communion and hear the Holy Mass, you're going to have to go to either find an underground diocesan, find SSPX, or find a Sedevacantist Mass. That's just the facts, And when you push people into a corner and say, thou shalt not have the Mass, and a Catholic desires the Mass because that's what Catholics do, well then this is what happens of necessity. I mean, if this isn't an emergency situation, please tell me what an emergency situation actually is. If you can't, if there's no mass, it's canceled. I think that's kind of the definition. There's never been more of an emergency than there is right now.
Well, at least in the last, I don't know how many hundreds,
thousands
of years.
Never has the mass been completely canceled like it is now. Never ever.
Even in communist persecution, there were still masses. So
yeah, I don't know. I don't know if in back parts of Africa and Asia and South America, like in the Amazon, I don't know, are they canceled? I haven't heard anything about it, so I just have to assume everybody's canceled everywhere in the whole world. So that's what I think about that. So that's my overall thoughts on this whole thing, and then you can ask different questions about the whole schism question and all that stuff.
Yeah, well, I do want to talk a little bit because I want to go to the SSPX website, which I'll link down below, and they, one of the criticisms of Tim Gordon is the SSPX members have a schismatic attitude. I'm just going to read off his quotes that he was saying. He said, he's not. I don't think he's saying that the SSPX are schismatics. He just doesn't like the schismatic attitude. He says, obviously, the Novus Ordo should be abolished, and the Latin Rite should have the extraordinary form only. But I await the Church to do this rather than some guy out of the back of his van. And a priest said, oh, what do you have against the Novus Ordo? Tim Gordon said, I've only been to one faithful non-TLM Mass in my whole life, but if you offer such a one, then I appreciate you for it, Father. So Tim Gordon, who pretty much regularly attends the Novus Ordo, says, I've only been to one faithful non-TLM Mass in my life. Okay, Tim. I think you need to look up the closest SSPX chapel.
Well, he did say Novus Ordo, so... But it sounds to me like his argument is not... that it's more like that now that you have access to the old Mass via diocesan priests, FSSP, and all this, then therefore you should go to their chapels. Okay, that's understandable. That's a reasonable argument. But, I mean, right now, we're talking about a time when, for instance, Taylor Marshall doesn't have the Mass because it's canceled. So he doesn't even have the option of going to any kind of above ground Novus Ordo establishment Latin Mass. So that, what Tim Gordon says is sounds reasonable to me, but this is a whole new paradigm because of the cancellation.
Now that you mentioned the FSSP, do you want to just talk a little bit about like the formation of the FSSP? I know that two of the biggest, Latin Mass orders that are in full canonical status with Rome are the FSSP and Institute of Christ the King. I think that's correct.
I think those are the two big ones.
The FSSP was established in 1988 by former members of the SSPX. Now, we talked about the SSPX before, and I have the full video and then a clip of the video of Ryan discussing that. So if you haven't watched that, go ahead and refresh yourself with that. The FSSP, I guess they sort of break off once Lefebvre consecrated the bishops.
Mm-hmm.
And then as an I don't know if Rome was trying to, stomp out the SSPX by allowing the FSSP, or because that was kind of the sentiment that some people say. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that you kind of see, but it might not be true. And
yeah, there's a lot of at that time there was a lot of bickering and rivalry between those two groups because, well, we can go into that if you ask me to go into it.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, what happened? So in '88, Archbishop Lefebvre was trying to work out a deal with the authorities in Rome because he was over 80 years old. He didn't know how much longer he was going to live. He had this society that was the only group of priests as a whole who were saying the Old Mass and doing the traditional formation of priests. And he wanted Rome to recognize their community, re-recognize the community, because it had recognition in the 70s, but then it was unjustly taken away. So he was trying to get a deal with Rome that they would recognize the society, recognize their positions that were namely that we can say the Old Mass, we don't have to accept the New Mass, and we can continue to do the traditional formation of priests and teach the faith as it was taught to us by all the previous popes, and resist the errors of Vatican II, namely those things that contradicted the previous magisterium on topics like collegiality and ecumenism, and there was one other thing. Ecumenism, collegiality, unfortunately I don't remember what that other thing was. But anyway, with that in mind, he was in talks with Rome, and they had some kind of deal worked out, but then the deal kept getting changed from Rome. I don't know how many bishops Archbishop Lefebvre wanted, whether it was 1 or 2 or 3. I don't know how many he asked for. But they were changing like the number of bishops and the date that the consecration would be. They just kept pushing the thing back. And finally he said, I've had enough of this. You're actually not interested in making a deal. I have all the proof I need that this is an emergency situation. And so I'm going to go ahead and go forward with the consecrations of these bishops. So that kind of created, there were some members of the SSPX who, I guess they thought that a deal would be made, and they started to get cold feet when they heard about that Rome had threatened that there would be an excommunication on Archbishop Lefebvre if he did these episcopal consecrations. So some of these priests got cold feet, and they started to have back channel or maybe front channel talks with the Roman authorities. That would be like Cardinal Ratzinger, who was part of these negotiations. And so after Archbishop Lefebvre did the consecrations, Rome issued this decree and said that he was automatically excommunicated, and then very shortly thereafter they established a priestly fraternity of St. Peter. And I think there was 10 or 12 guys who were former SSPX priests who joined, were the founding members of that society. So that was the first time that the Pope really had ever given, that Rome had ever acknowledged that there can be a group of priests who in act reject the new Mass and only say the old, and keep to the traditional priestly formation and the traditional order of the sacraments with the ritual and the pontifical and all those things. So that was the first kind of instance of one of these traditionalist societies being formed in the mainstream church with canonical recognition.
And, I've looked at the maps, FSSP, SSPX, and Institute of Christ the King, where they have locations throughout the world, particularly the United States, but throughout the world. And it's interesting, there's not a whole lot of overlap between the three organizations.
Okay.
There might be, a certain city might have an SSPX chapel and an FSSP parish, but it seems like sometimes they might have been hesitant to put churches in the different cities. Now with the SSPX, I didn't realize how gigantic the society was. They're all over the world. And for the different dots on the map, I was shocked. There's a ton in Mexico. They're in pretty much, I think they're in every continent except Antarctica.
Yeah, they've got in France. They're huge there because Archbishop Lefebvre was French, and he was able to get a lot of support there, and so they have a lot of chapels. They have a lot of faithful. You have to consider that in France, most of the Novus Ordo people are lapsed. There aren't any more Novus Ordo people in France. So you have the point where they are close to having more people go to SSPX masses in the entire country of France than that go to the Novus Ordo.
Wow.
And the number of ordinations that they have is huge. I don't know if it's surpassed the entire Novus Ordo establishment in France, but it's really close. So that's their stronghold, and then, various other places, they have more or less chapels. One thing that I noticed, being familiar with this traditionalist question since 2001, is that often what had happened was the local diocesan bishop would be against the Latin Mass, and he says, absolutely not, I will not have the Latin Mass in my diocese, even though the Pope had said you should allow the Latin Mass. But of course, bishops, being a stiff-necked and rebellious people, said no. So what had happened is the people would be like, well, if you won't let us have a Mass, we'll call SSPX. And here comes SSPX, and they come with a priest, and if you give them money and build a chapel, they'll staff it. So once the bishop is like, these people are not listening to what I say, and they still like the Latin Mass, and he'll say, I know what I'll do. I'll set up a rival Latin Mass community where he'll invite in the Fraternity of St. Peter, or he'll have a diocesan guy set up a Latin Mass there. I mean, this is the kind of thing that happened. I think this is how Pittsburgh got the Latin Mass, and Erie got the Latin Mass. Various other places too. Is SSPX, I think, moved in first, and people started going there, and the bishop got jealous, and he's like, well, I guess there is a demand after all. Even though I said you shall not have the Latin Mass, he gave it to him anyway once the SSPX showed up. And
and that's an interesting point, and to note, the FSSP Institute of Christ the King, their donations, the diocese takes a cut of their donations.
Yeah, just as opposed with every parish.
As opposed to the SSPX, who said, nope, we're not giving you any. They're not under the jurisdiction of that bishop. They're not going to give them any of the donations. So you can see where the bishop might get a little bit more friendly towards tradition whenever the SSPX is stealing some of their members and.
Yeah. And I mean, they are under his jurisdiction in some sense. He doesn't have entire control over that situation, but he certainly doesn't get any of their money. That money stays within that particular SSPX apostolate chapel, and maybe some of it goes to headquarters. I'm not exactly sure. But certainly the diocesan bishop doesn't get any of that money.
Now, I wanted to point out just a few interesting locations for the SSPX, because looking at the map, it's like, oh, wow. So Africa, of course, Archbishop Lefebvre, he basically converted most of Africa. Cuba, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Hong Kong, and several Pacific islands north of Australia.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's a really remote place. you think about the Jesuits of the last several hundred years, and how they were evangelizing these remote places. Well, this is the SSPX.
Yeah.
I was saying, the Amazon Synod, I noticed they have some churches in South America.
Yeah.
There's none in the Amazon region there's no SSPX churches in the Amazon region, but I'll bet if you ask them to go to the Amazon and evangelize, I'll bet the SSPX will be the first order to sign up for it.
Yeah.
Which is interesting, and it tells you something about the order.
And by the way, to our friend Patty, who watches every episode and comments, I know he said that he's in Northern Ireland, and so I did look up, and there are SSPX chapels there in Northern Ireland. I think there's 2. So as we discussed when we were eating lunch, I mean, that's a pretty small country, and it takes like 2.5 hours to drive from one end to the other. So pretty much no matter where you are, you could get to the Latin Mass in Northern Ireland. With the whole cancellation thing, I would, call ahead before you. Everybody should be calling anywhere before they show up, because with this cancellation and the virus, you have no idea what's going to happen when you get there. You don't know.
Yeah. Shout out to Patty. We appreciate your comments.
Thank you, Patty. Our friend from Northern Ireland.
Now, getting back to some arguments against the SSPX, they have referenced on their website that the Novus Ordo is evil, and I do want to read a little bit of a clip that I've taken from their website. Now they say, you well know that the believer has above all the obligation to cultivate and protect his faith, for it is the root and the foundation of his eternal salvation. That is why natural divine law forbids him to endanger it. You also know that precisely for this reason the Church has always forbidden Catholics to participate in non-Catholic masses, even if they are valid. This is why the Catholic finds himself in an Orthodox, schismatic country. He is unable to find a place of Catholic worship. Not only is he dispensed from the obligation to hear Mass, but if he participates in the Mass of the schismatics, valid once again, he is not excused from committing a sin against the faith. And this is so in virtue of divine natural law, that is to say, even if the ecclesiastical laws have changed for ecumenical reasons. So this is saying that the SSPX, they're saying that they are opposed to any schism of any kind. I mean, I found that interesting. They say, we do consider the new rite to be heretical. We do not consider the new rite to be heretical, but rather gravely equivocal and favoring heresy. This rite was in fact elaborated with a discreet, but not too discreet, cooperation of certain Protestant experts, so that it would be acceptable to both the Catholics and the Protestants. So, what I have to say about that is, they come right out and say we don't think the new rite's heretical, but we say there's a lot of elements that are heretical.
Dangerous.
Well, and here's the thing: if you would talk privately to an SSPX or FSSP or Institute of Christ the King priest, would they hold the same ideas?
Well, I think they would probably all say the same thing.
But they wouldn't say it publicly.
The difference is that the SSPX is free to say their mind publicly, whereas Fraternity of St. Peter, Institute of Christ the King, Diocesan Priest is not allowed to say what he thinks publicly because of the bishop will smack him.
So this schismatic attitude, and what's interesting about what I was reading is that Tim Gordon says about the same thing. I quoted him earlier, and he said about the same thing.
I know, so I don't have any problem with what he said. I mean, the whole thing comes down to, you keep talking about, and you've mentioned, what is this? First off, can we get a definition of schism? What is it? And then what exactly is a schismatic attitude? And then let's discuss all that. And so I don't think that you could, well, depending on what your definition of schism is, well, then you could make an argument about whether the SSPX is or is not in schism. But we have to find out, what do you say schism is? Therefore, then we can then talk about it and make judgment calls.
So do you want to get into that right now?
Well, you don't. I'm prepared for that, but you have to give me what your definition of schism is, because I've heard different definitions from several different people.
Well, John the Son of Thunder's definition of schism, I mean, I guess we've been talking about obedience in some of our past episodes, and I would say schism is a deviation from the traditional Catholic doctrine, deviation from the Bible. So I don't know, and does it matter?
That's not schism, that would be heresy.
Well, does it matter? So I guess the question would be, I don't know, but does it, if you're deviating from a pope.
What do you mean
Like
by
if
deviating?
If the pope tells you to do something and you don't do it,
What is it that he's telling you to do?
Like the consecration of bishops.
Uh-huh.
So were the SSPX actually in schism whenever Lefebvre?
Yeah, so that's the
Consecrated
interesting
bishops.
question, and so here's various different opinions about that. Bishop Schneider was just on Taylor Marshall's show, and he said what the SSPX did as far as those consecrations does not meet the definition of schism. Point number one. Point two, another bit of information is when the Rome issued that decree, the document Ecclesia Dei ad Flicta, which was released in 1988, it said that Archbishop Lefebvre and all those bishops were automatically excommunicated because they did a schismatic act. The whole problem with that is that document attempted to read the mind and intentions of Archbishop Lefebvre and those consecrated bishops, which they don't have the power to read minds. You can only go by what external words and actions are. And Archbishop Lefebvre in that ceremony said that I'm not setting up a parallel church, which is kind of the definition of schism. I'm not doing this out of a spirit of disobedience or rejection of the Pope's authority, which is kind of a definition of schism, but rather I'm doing this because of a temporary emergency situation. So, and I feel a sense of fear and a sense of necessity. All of that, according to the canon law, means that there's no crime of schism that occurs, and there's no actual schism that has occurred. And if you don't like Bishop Schneider's opinion, if you don't like, then you can take a look at the opinion of Father Gerald Murray of the Papal Posse, who wrote a bachelor's or master's thesis about this very topic, and his opinion was that Archbishop Lefebvre and those bishops were never excommunicated. They never committed the canonical crime of schism, and so that's what he said. That thesis was accepted in, I think maybe it was the Lateran College in Rome. You can read yesterday or earlier, Father Zulsdorf of Internet fame wrote that excellent article about the SSPX question, answered it on his website, and said by no definition do they meet, by no definition of schism do they meet it. So therefore, you make a very strong argument that that they don't meet the definition of schism. So you have those several different opinions. Then you have the Pope's opinion. So the Pope's opinion is that they're not. The Pope's opinion is that they are in the Catholic Church, and they just are in a strange situation as far as the law of the Church goes.
Yeah, canonically irregular.
Yeah. So this is why he, as Archbishop of Buenos Aires, talked to the local SSPX superior and gave him credentials within the diocese, within the country, so they could bring in priests. He considered them to be part of the Catholic Church. He did so further when he explicitly gave SSPX priests the ability to hear confessions and do marriages without any question about the validity of those, and that they're free, especially when it comes to the marriages, to work with the diocesan bishop to register those weddings and get faculties from him and that kind of thing. Bishop Fillet, who was the former superior of the SSPX, said that for the most part, when he goes to ordain priests, he is getting permission from the local Novus Ordo diocesan bishops to ordain priests. So, with all this in mind, you have this complete situation where, though the SSPX, those priests don't have an incarnation in a diocese, and they're kind of in a strange canonical situation, they don't meet the definition of schism because the Pope is giving them powers, giving them authority, recognizing them as part of the Church, etc., etc., etc. So if you want to argue against that, well, then that's fine. But you know that you're arguing against the Pope, okay? You're arguing against Bishop Schneider. You're arguing against Father Zulsdorf, and all those guys know more than I do. So,
Well,
what more can I say?
and one person that argues against all those guys is Cardinal Burke.
Yeah.
And there's an article, and basically you just addressed all the points that he raised as concerns. I don't really know. I don't know.
Why does Cardinal? So you're saying that Cardinal Burke opposes the Pope? Is that what you're saying?
Well,
But he told me that he never opposes the Pope. I mean, he said that in an interview. So is he opposing the magisterium of Pope Francis?
I'm not standing up for
if he
Cardinal
won't-
Burke here.
I mean, I guess he did speak out against the Mors Laetitia, but I mean, I guess he wrote a strongly worded, dubia or something. But
Well, and I guess one of the definitions of schism would be opposing the Pope in the canon. So, like, we pray for our Pope, the Holy Father, whoever. So in this case, it would be Francis. Well, the SSPX does that. They acknowledge Francis as the Pope. So I don't know. I don't know where Cardinal Burke is kind of getting this.
I don't know where he gets this stuff from.
opposition
I
here,
think
but-
I haven't looked into what he has said exactly, and when I have, I said this is so legalistic that and he is a canon lawyer, so he understands everything from the viewpoint of legalism, and maybe that's okay if this was the era of Pope Pius XI and Pope Pius XII, but after Vatican II, everything is crazy now. And so don't expect things to be normal. I mean, bishops are not following canon law. They're suspending priests willy-nilly for like, oh, you're running a blog. I suspend you! And, oh, you're you're denying Holy Communion to a lesbian Buddhist. I suspend you! So much for, okay, wonderful Cardinal Burke. Maybe in your fantastic magical world where bishops obey canon law, that's the way it is. But in the real world here, canon law isn't worth the paper that it's printed on. And I'm not saying that's a good thing. I'm just saying that's just the way things are.
So in closing, is it okay to attend an SSPX Mass in normal times? So like, for example, in January before this virus shut everything down, would it have been okay to attend an SSPX Mass?
Yeah, I think the opinion of the people that know what they're talking about, namely Bishop Schneider and Father Zulsdorf, who, by the way, read his article. You can put the link in the description about somebody questioned him about SSPX, and he said, based on these particular reasons, yeah, there's no reason why you can't attend an SSPX Mass. So, I mean, me in particular, there's no SSPX around here. I've been to places and I've attended one of their Masses because it was close to me and I wanted to go there. And like the fraternity parish was way on the other side of town. It was like in some basement, and they were having Mass at 7 at night. And I was like, no, I'm not going a whole way across town at 7 at night to go hear a Mass when the bishop put them in a basement. I'll just go to the SSPX chapel where they have a real church, actually. So, there's a way to abuse this kind of thing if you actually do have a schismatic spirit where you're like, people in that Novus Ordo church is, those people are like outside the church or they're all heretics. I mean, but there's people who say that kind of stuff who are in the Novus Ordo church. I mean, there's Novus Ordo bishops and lay people who say somebody who likes the old Mass is a heretic and a schismatic or whatever. And so, that's dividing up the church, and so you shouldn't do that. I mean, the whole thing about this is, if you read this book, this is called the Holy Bible, and it contains the words of our Lord Jesus Christ. And in this book, he gave a prayer. It's in John's Gospel, and it's this very lengthy discourse about unity in the church and staying together. Father, I pray that they may be one as you and I are one. And the bottom line here is that no matter where you're going to Mass, if you're SSPX, Sedevacantist, or Eastern Orthodox, or whatever, or Protestant, our goal is to promote unity, okay? So we need to get, number one, a unity of faith with SSPX We have that with the Sedevacantists. We have that with the Eastern Orthodox. We don't have that yet, but we're coming to a closer understanding, because a lot of the disputes there have to do with historical things and language, and we'll get to that in a future video. But so you get everybody on the same page when it comes to faith, and then you need to do what you can to get these disciplines jiving with each other, and then we can have everybody in a canonically regular situation and have intercommunion with each other. I mean, we have more or less intercommunion with SSPX and Sedevacantists. With the Eastern Orthodox, we don't on paper yet have this intercommunion, although it's really up to each individual priest as far as who he gives communion to and that kind of thing. And so the bottom line is we need to foster unity here and not try to divide up the church and say, you're outside the church, because it's not your job to tell people who is outside the church. It is your job to tell people, to get people into the Catholic Church, and the way you do that is by baptism and receiving the sacraments. So that is your job. Your job is not to tell people that they're wrong and heretics and schismatics and all this, to excommunicate people. That is not the job of lay people. That is the job of bishops. And maybe some priests who are well educated can discuss this sort of thing. But the job of lay people is to say their prayers, go get the sacraments, encourage other people to say prayers and get the sacraments, and to read about the faith. That's the job of a lay person.
All right, well, thank you, Ryan.
You're welcome.
And I hope that answers all your questions about SSPX. It's a very strange situation, and it was made even stranger with Summorum Pontificum and under Pope Benedict and Pope Francis granting canonical faculties to the SSPX. And so this is a question that a lot of people have had probably for a long time, and hopefully that kind of answers some questions and clarifies some things a little bit.
Yep. Thank you.